Good evening, everybody. We'll get us started here on time. My name is Martha Garrig. I'm with Michigan Sea Grant and Michigan State University Extension. And in partnership with MMU's biology department, I am so pleased that you are all here to join us here in person and then with our online audience as well. I am so pleased to introduce to you from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, our Detroit district, the Office of Great Lakes Hydraulics and Hydrology, Dr. Lauren Fry and Chris Warren. We are lucky enough, because they've been traveling the state giving these presentations to interested communities, we were lucky to grab them on their way back to Detroit from Houghton. We just snagged them in Marquette. So thank you to both of them for traveling, and we look forward to your presentation.
So first off, thank you, Martha, and thank you, Sea Grant. We really appreciate the opportunity to extend our trip in the UP and add an additional outreach event. This is actually something that we're doing a lot of these days. So really happy to be here and sharing what we can about high water levels. I'm sure you guys know a lot too. I'm Lauren Fry. I'm from the Office of Great Lakes Hydraulics and Hydrology of the Detroit District of the Army Corps of Engineers. We're here talking about water levels. What you might ask, why are we talking about water levels, and what is the Corps' role in terms of monitoring and forecasting water levels? Our office has kind of a unique role of supporting the regulation of Lake Superior outflow, regulation of Lake Ontario outflow, through the boards of control of the International Joint Commission. And so we don't make regulation decisions in our office, but we are providing technical support in the form of modeling, forecasting, and monitoring water levels and water budget components. That's why we are doing this, and that's why when you see water level forecasts going out into the seasons ahead, that's coming from our office. Everything that we're doing is in partnership with our Canadian counterparts. And so that's kind of a background of why we're talking about water levels here. So just a really simple outline of what we'll be talking about. We're going to start by talking about where water levels are right now. It's not going to be a surprise to you guys that they're high, but how do we compare to the historical record that we have? I'll get into that a little bit, and then talk about why we're at the high water levels that we are right now. And then I'm going to hand it over to Chris, who's going to talk about our latest forecast, what went into the development of that forecast in terms of what we're looking at in the next 6 months. Water levels are high right now, right? Everybody knows this. I'm going to start at the most upstream lake, and in my opinion, my favorite lake, Lake Superior. So this is in Duluth, and so October of 2018, there was a big storm that not only did it have a lot of rain, but it also had wind conditions, and we were already at pretty high conditions in the fall of 2018. So this is a picture from that storm. This is in the Duluth Harbor, and yes, that's a big wave about to hit that bridge. There was millions of dollars worth of damage in Duluth, and similar storms have happened more recently than that. So now going downstream from here, this is Lake Michigan Huron. This is a photo taken by another Sea Grant, one of your colleagues, Mark Friederland. On the left, this is a picture taken during the low water period. This is from 2008 in Grand Traverse Bay, and this is in May of this past year in 2019. And so this is a pretty significant difference. I think the difference between these two pictures was about 5 feet. You can see challenges related to access when we have low water. Here it looks like a nice dock that you could use. But we're seeing marinas that are flooding and are having to shut down because of power issues and things like that. But also what you saw there was impacts during calm conditions. When we have meteorological conditions on top of those on top of those high water levels, we can see pretty severe impacts. So this is just one example of an impact that's happened on the shore of Lake Michigan. This past December, we started to hear news of homes falling into the lake. And so these are pretty severe impacts when you have meteorological conditions causing waves. And then further downstream, this is Lake Erie. This is the image from my title slide. So this is Stony Point, which is kind of out in the west end of Lake Erie. And this was taken last spring. Lake Erie is particularly prone to events where you have southwest wind or northeast wind, which is parallel to the axis of the lake. And so you can have events like a Statia event where water can stack up on one side or the other. So when you have that kind of a condition on top of high water levels and with wind and waves, you can see pretty significant flooding impacts, such as what you're seeing here. So these homes are actually just getting battered by waves on Lake Erie. Now, furthest downstream, Lake Ontario. This is the image from last winter, sometime around now, last winter. This house, actually one of our colleagues knew the people who lived in this house, and this house was in the news all over the place in New York. You know, you can have freezing spray. You guys know about freezing spray. That happens at low water levels, but when water levels are high, the freezing spray is happening right in this person's backyard and really just covering their house. So that's an actual house, not a snow sculpture. So we kind of quickly walked through the basin with images, and I'm sure that at least this image is familiar to all of you, and maybe this image as well. But I like to bring it up in our talk just to kind of hit home a couple of things. First is that when we look at the Great Lakes Basin, a very large portion of the basin is covered in surface fresh water. It's an advantage. We have 20% of the world's surface fresh water. That's pretty cool. It also makes it very difficult. You know, it adds challenges in the form of how we can measure precipitation over the lakes, how we can measure evaporation from the lakes. Those are important processes on these lakes that are less important for other large river systems of the world. We think of this as a river system because it's really draining into the Atlantic Ocean via the St. Lawrence River. So now here, this is a cross section of the Great Lakes going from west, Lake Superior, to east in the Atlantic Ocean. So Lake Superior, I'm showing Lake Michigan and Huron here. There is shown as one lake, and that's because Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, they rise and fall together as one lake. They're connected as the straits. So as one rises, the other one rises at the same rate. So while maybe biologists will think of them as two lakes, I think of them as one lake. You can see Lake St. Clair is just kind of a blip in the Detroit River, but we consider it a Great Lake. And Lake Erie, one thing to note here is that Lake Michigan, Huron, Lake St. Clair, and Lake Erie are all very connected. The outflows from Lake St. Clair by the Detroit River, that's going to be impacted by both the water level on the upstream lake, Lake St. Clair, and the downstream lake, Lake Erie. So the lake levels from one lake to the other actually impact the flows through the connecting channels. So it's a very interrelated system. Now, when we look at Lake Ontario, one thing we can point out, obviously, is that what happens on Lake Ontario is going to have no impact on the rest of us, and that's because of the Niagara Falls. So, you know, if water levels are high on Lake Ontario, that doesn't mean we're going to have some backwater impact on the other lake. So before I go into some of the details on where water levels are right now and historical record, I just want to bring us all on the same page about water levels. So first, when I'm talking about water levels, I'm not talking about a depth. I'm talking about an elevation, and it's essentially elevation above sea level. We're really talking about elevation using the International Great Lakes Datum, which has a reference point really pretty much at the outlet of the St. Lawrence River. So it's essentially elevation above. The levels that we monitor and record as official water levels are going to be the monthly mean lake-wide average water levels. There's a lot of variability across the lake on a given day and from day to day. So we really talk about things on a monthly mean lake-wide average water levels. It's a mouthful, but that's how I'm going to be referring to it throughout the talk. So it's based on still water. The levels that you actually observe on a day-to-day basis right here in Marquette could be substantially different from what we're actually reporting even in our daily levels, because the level can vary across. We use this network of gauges, which I'll show in a little bit. And on the U.S. side, the Detroit District Corps of Engineers, we're the official keeper of the water levels. So if you want the official statistics, come to the Army Corps of Engineers. If you want the official records, what was the record high, record low, come to us. If you want more location-specific information, go to NOAA to look at water level gauges. I mentioned this earlier, but everything we do for Great Lakes water level monitoring and forecasting is done in coordination with our partners in Environment Climate Change Canada. So I mentioned that we measure water levels using a network of gauges. This network of gauges is owned and operated by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, on the US side, and by the Canadian Hydrographic Service, shown in green on the Canadian. The gauges, the dots here that look kind of like a donut, they have a solid dot and a ring around it. Those are the gauges that we actually use to compute our lake-wide average water levels. So it's been, studied, and we found that those are the best set of gauges to represent the full, account for the variability of water levels across the lake. So on Lake Superior, we're looking at Duluth, Marquette, Point Iroquois, Thunder Bay, and Michigan. So you guys have a water level gauge right here that we look at on a regular basis to compute lake-wide average water level. So we take those water levels. Those are provided on a sub-daily time step. We then average at each gauge. We compute the daily average, and then from those gauge averages, we then compute a lake-wide average water level. And we do, even though they're not official levels, we do provide these daily lake-wide average water levels on our webpage. So we compute lake-wide average water levels each day, and then at the end of the month, well, we actually keep a running average for the month, but then at the end of the month, we compute the monthly mean lake-wide average water level, and that's our official water level. So looking at those monthly mean lake-wide average water levels, starting in May, Lake Superior was hitting new record high water levels. So Lake Superior, St. Clair, and Erie all hit new record high water levels in May. Superior continued through July to set new record high water levels. And then in August, Superior tied its previous record high, and in September, it tied its previous record high. Now, again, in January, we saw another new record high. And our record highs are all going to be relative to previous months. So the May record high is relative to historical May levels. So just considering the seasonal variability. And I'll show this in a minute, but our period of record goes back all the way to 1918, so it's just over 100 years. Speaking of our 100 years of data, we update this graphic on a monthly basis, and it's on our webpage. I know there's a lot to look at. There's numbers. Don't worry so much about the numbers at this point. What I do want to focus on are the wiggles on the graph. And every set of graphs that I go through, I'll always start on Lake Superior as most upstream and end on Lake Ontario. So we have Lake Superior, Michigan Huron, Lake St. Clair, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario. So the first thing to point out is you see kind of a regular periodicity. And so for those of you who are close to the lake, you recognize that seasonal cycle. You have up and down cycle during the year. The other thing to point out is that you have interannual variability. And so you have interannual variability, you have monthly variability, and you have even beyond kind of like the decadal time frame, although that's not an exact cycle. The next thing to point out on here, for those of you who have been here at least for 7 years, you'll remember that at the beginning of 2013, we saw pretty low water levels here. So the beginning of 2013 was the end of a very long period of low water levels that started really with a decline in the late 1990s. So it's just over a decade of low water levels. Lake Superior had a new record low water level in 2007. Lake Michigan Huron had record lows at the end of 2012 and 2013. Now, during low water periods, we have impacts as well. Those of you who remember low water periods will remember there were issues in terms of accessing boat docks. My husband and I have a small sailboat, like about 16 feet, and we camp on it, and we had to, climb up the ladder to get out. Now we don't have that problem. There's impacts in the form of navigation, having to carry lighter loads, impacting beach vegetation, more growth in vegetation, more dredging desired, less hydropower generated. So subsequent to that low water period that ended in the end of 2012, beginning of 2013, we actually saw a record-setting 2-year rise in 2013 and 2014 on Lake Superior and Lake Michigan Huron. So we saw a record-setting 2-year rise, and I'll get into a little detail on what we saw for those conditions. And then subsequent to that, in 2017, 18, and 19, we really had very wet conditions again. And now that's what's leading us up to new record highs in 2019 and now looking ahead at 2020. So now with high water levels, we have very different impacts. We have shoreline erosion impacts. There's always erosion, whether you're at low water levels or high water levels. But at high water levels, that erosion is happening really close to property and infrastructure. So it's very impactful. So you can have property damage. I talked a little bit about SAICH events. Lake Erie is particularly prone to SAICH events on a lake basis, but Lake Superior can certainly be impacted by SAICH events, especially in the bays. When you have ice jams, they can be more impactful. So flooding behind ice jams can be a bigger problem under high water level conditions. We're also seeing news about submerged structures that are no longer evident. You don't see them when you're in a boat, and so they can be hazardous. This picture I think is from last year, right here on Lakeshore Drive. Okay, so now I'm just going to dive into just a little more detail on each lake, what's happening that's of interest on each lake. So starting with Lake Superior, and this graphic is going to appear in the same form but for each lake. So I'm going to walk through it in a little more detail for Lake Superior. So on the x-axis, we're just going back a couple of years in time, month by month. The black horizontal lines in the middle, those are showing the long-term average monthly mean lakewide average water levels. So that's kind of the typical seasonal cycle that Lake Superior would see. And these gray lines below and above are showing the record low and record high water levels. The blue dots, those are showing the observed monthly mean lakewide average water levels going back a couple of years, and the thin black line is showing the daily variability. So we are showing the daily water levels. I already talked about this image here. This was actually associated with this 3.5-inch rise. We normally don't think of single events as having a large impact on Great Lakes water levels. This was a very widespread system. I was up here there was a State of Lake Superior conference in Houghton, and I was here, and it was snowing and raining and sleeting the whole time. And that was that jump in water level that we saw right there. This is that event, the Father's Day storm in 2018 as well in Houghton that caused significant flooding and damage. We don't see that same kind of jump on the lake. So normally for storm, isolated conditions, we don't see a dramatic sustained jump in water levels, but we can, for example, like we did in that October storm. Of course, flooding impacts can be made worse when you're at high water levels and it takes longer for water to leave the area, right? Going downstream to Lake Michigan and Huron, they've got the same type of graphic here. And the thing that really stands out to me when I look at this is a very big seasonal rise last spring, and then followed by a very small seasonal decline. So like if you look at this black pattern, this would be a normal seasonal decline, really kind of flat line this fall. So Lake Michigan Huron declined about 5 inches compared to a normal decline of about 12 inches. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But impacts that we've seen on Lake Michigan Huron, I already showed this image of eroding bluffs. There's also flooding in other parts of the lake, depending on what your coast is like. We'll have different impacts. And then this is a Meteo tsunami event in April 2018. So we have Meteo tsunamis all the time, but when we're at high water levels, we just notice them. So Meteo tsunami is essentially a wave that has a similar characteristic in terms of frequency to a seismically produced tsunami, but it's produced by atmospheric conditions. And we don't pay attention to them when we're at low water levels, and sometimes you don't even see them. But at high water levels, you can have a whole pier. This is a pier at Ludington that just disappeared for a minute. So now further downstream, I did mention that Lake St. Clair, we think of that as a Great Lake, even though it's small, but it's part of the system. And Lake St. Clair has different impacts. It tends to react quickly to events, but also just upstream from Lake St. Clair, we have on the St. Clair River, there's communities that are prone to flooding when there's ice jams. So So you can see an ice jam in the hydrograph right here where the water level on Lake St. Clair actually takes a little nosedive in the winter. And that means that the water's not getting to Lake St. Clair. It's piling up upstream of the ice jam. And so communities just above Lake St. Clair really are experiencing flooding when that happens. This is in 2018, and it's a little hard to see on here, but if I point out this right here, this is a boat lift in a like a little boathouse shelter boat lift. So this is the water, this is their driveway, and the water is just turning into ice right on their driveway as a result of that ice jam. Now on Lake Erie, we've just been consistently above long-term average water levels for the past couple of years. And I mentioned earlier the impact of SAICH events. So this is a SAICH event that caused flooding in a community on Lake Erie. I think this is on the west end, so it would have been like a northeast wind pushing water toward the west end. Last winter, we saw interesting ice flow on the Niagara River. If you look up on YouTube, ice flow, Niagara River, Fort Erie, and you'll see a pretty cool video of this ice just like moving along in that much ice just moving along. And it's hard to imagine just being right there in that spot, but it's a pretty cool video to watch. Now, furthest downstream, Lake Ontario, these graphics only go back a couple of years, but if we extended it back further to 2017, we would actually see another spike in water levels in 2017. Lake Ontario actually saw record high water levels in 2017, and then again in 2019 with some pretty severe flooding. You see some flooding here, and this is the ice house I showed you earlier. So in terms of what causes water levels, the first thing I'm going to talk about is this seasonal periodicity that you see here, so the up and down on a regular basis. All of the lakes follow a fairly similar seasonal cycle. It's fairly predictable. The amount is more difficult to predict, but we generally expect water levels to be lowest in the winter, highest in the late summer, early fall, and then declining again in the fall and winter. In the winter, like right now, we're getting our precipitation and snow. Instead of running off directly into the lake, the water is piling up as solid water, snow on the surface of the watershed. It's just kind of a slow time. Then when we start to see the warm conditions to come in the spring, we start to see that snow melting and causing increased runoff in the spring. In addition, we'll have more precipitation in the spring coming in the form of liquid precipitation, so that can run off directly into the lakes. In the summer, generally we see more drought conditions in the summer, but what's more important in the summer, the sun's energy is really warming the surface of the lake. So you start out the season in June, the lake is really cold to swim in, but by September you're feeling maybe I can go swimming. I'm sure you guys are braver than me, but you're going to have warmer water temperatures this time of year, so that's really energy being transferred into the lake. And that's important because then in the fall, that sets you up for a good amount of evaporation. The fall, late fall, early winter time frame is really the most important part of the year for evaporation. When you have relatively warm surface water temperatures compared to cold air that typically comes in the fall and early winter. So like I would expect we would have had a fair amount of evaporation the past couple days. So we think of those three things together, the precipitation over the lake, the runoff into the lake, and the evaporation from the lake. We combine those three things together and call it net basin supply. So that's the net basin supply of water to the lake. So I'll probably use that term as I talk further. When the net basin supply plus the inflow from upstream lakes minus the outflow to downstream lakes, when the net basin supply and the inflow are bigger than the outflow, your water levels go up and vice versa. Just a water balance. So I was talking about net basin supply, and the graphic here has a lot of information. I'm going to show similar graphics for each lake, so I'm going to walk you through it. On the left, this is just kind of the last 10 years or so of that long-term hydrograph that I showed earlier. On the bottom part of this panel, this is showing the water levels. the top part of the panel, this is showing the annual net basin supply. So that's the precipitation, runoff, and evaporation combined together on an annual basis going back to 1997. So we saw pretty low net basin supply consistently. And then right here, 2013, since 2013, we have had consistently above average net basin supply. All 7 of the past 7 years have been above average net basin supply, and really pretty high in about 4 of those years. You don't need to go into the numbers on here, but you can see the pattern is similar on Lake Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, Ontario. It's really similar across the board. 5 out of the past 7 years were above average on Lake Michigan, Huron. Similar story on Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. So we've had very consistently high net basin supply since 2013. Go back to 2013 and 14 when we saw that record-setting 2-year rise. The maps I'm showing here are showing the ranking of precipitation on the top, and 2013 on the left and 2014 on the right. So green would be like the wetter precipitation out of the period of record. I think there's 125 years of record, and brown would be drier. So 2013 very wet, 2014 fairly wet also. On the bottom, I'm showing the same kind of plot ranking for temperature. So blue is cold, red being warmer rain years. And so what we see, so Great Lakes Basin was wet 2013-14, but it was also very cold in 2014. So this would have been when we started hearing about the polar vortex and all that. So we have pretty cold conditions. So that was part of what was happening then. Now again, 15, 16 were a little less interesting, but 2017, 18, and 19 were also very wet. So in 2017, the Great Lakes Basin, at least on the U.S. side, we don't have a similar plot for Canada, but similar conditions were happening over there too. On the U.S. side, it was the 2nd wettest year on record in 2017. It was the 7th wettest year on record in 2018, and now 2019, it was the 1st wettest year on record in 2019. So it's been consistently wet for the past several years. And now here we are in 2020, and we're thinking, okay, what's coming up ahead? Chris will talk about what's coming up ahead, but I'm going to talk about what kind of sets us up, at least for the past month, why we maybe didn't see as much seasonal decline as we sometimes do, especially on Michigan Huron. It wasn't particularly wet. Looking back at January, it was the 23rd wettest January. I mean, it was a little wetter than average, but not particularly wet. What we did see was that January was warm. It was the 6th warmest January on record, again, out of 125 years. And so that kind of played into what we saw in January. And one of the ways that played into January's conditions was through reduced evaporation. Now this is actually showing higher evaporation in February. I took this image from MODIS satellite data on the 13th of February. So I talked about evaporation as happening when the water surface temperature is fairly warm and the air surface temperature is fairly cold. That's what's happening on the 13th of January, just last week. So you can see the evaporation coming off the lake that day. Water surface is fairly warm compared to the cold air that we had that day. This past January, we had pretty warm conditions. So the difference between the surface water temperature and the air temperature was much less. So we actually had, our models are showing we had reduced evaporation by a fair amount on Lake Superior and Lake Michigan Huron. So that was one part of why we didn't see the seasonal decline that we usually see on Lake Michigan Huron. In addition to that, remember I mentioned in the winter we think of precipitation coming as snow, just kind of accumulating on the surface of the earth. When we have a warmer than average winter, especially, I mean, in our neck of the woods, it's really been warm. The precipitation has been coming as rain. It's been running off. We've been having very high stream flows. And so these two maps are showing stream flows in December and January. So black would be high, blue would be much above normal or above the 90th percentile flows, if you think of it that way. So we had very high stream flows in much of the basin in December and January. Just to sum it up, that's what we're seeing here in this lack of seasonal decline was the warm December and January that we saw. So I'm going to pass it on to Chris, who's going to talk about our forecast.
All right, so yeah, thank you, Lauren, for kind of going over what we've seen and why it's caused changes in the Great Lakes. We'll move forward, kind of looking, what's coming up. So we'll start near term. So the graphic here on the top left is what we call our 7-day QPF. This is a quantitative precipitation forecast. This provides us an idea of how much water we expect to fall, whether it's rain or snow, in the next 7 days. This particular graphic is looking a lot better. So when we first put this presentation together, those darker blues and reds, those are higher precip values were kind of showing up over this region. Right now, here in Marquette, we're just getting a little bit of green, so somewhere between 100th and 1/10 of an inch of water over the next week. So that shouldn't translate to too much. Maybe an inch of snow. We'll see if that's actually true. Below that, we've got an 8 to 14 day precipitation forecast. And these graphics deserve a little bit of explanation. So these are probability phase plot diagrams or maps. So the green, which is again where we are looking at an increased likelihood of wetter than average conditions. It doesn't say how wet, just wetter than average. The brown, over in the Pacific Northwest, and then kind of getting down into California, those regions are an increased likelihood of below average precipitation. The 8 to 14 day uses gray, so that's near normal is what the expectation is. And then when we move out a little further, they start saying, well, okay, we're seeing a signal for above average precipitation in some regions, below average elsewhere. For the Great Lakes Basin, this is where I tease the meteorologists in our office. They use white, which is equal chances. So it could be more, it could be less. They don't know. They throw their hands up a little bit. It gets tricky when you're talking about that kind of range. The context here is that we may be looking at a slightly wetter end compared to average for February in the Great Lakes Basin, looking at that 8 to 14 day range and some of the 7 day. But the Great Lakes Basin as a whole is about 50% of the precipitation we would expect to see for February so far. So it's been a little dry so far, it might be a little wetter towards the end, doesn't necessarily mean we'll have a wet February in the grand scheme of things. So these are some similar plots. On the top, we have the temperature. There is no blue, so we'll ignore that. But again, the reds and oranges on the top is an increased likelihood of above average temperature. You'll notice, we've got 3 maps there. So it starts with March, April, May on the left, then April, May, June in the middle, and May, June, July. So they're kind of 3-month aggregates that shifts by month. For temperature in the Great Lakes Basin, we're not seeing a real big signal for temperature and its equal chances. Again, there's a little bit of a hint of some warm weather, coming in the May, June, July time frame, but that's pretty far out, pretty big signal. The bottom is kind of the more important piece. This is again the precipitation graphic, and we're seeing a consistent wet pattern in the Great Lakes Basin, really on out into the May, June, July time frame. So what that means is the Climate Prediction Center, which aggregates climate models and kind of looks into the future as our crystal ball is however clear or foggy it is, and they're saying the signal is that it's likely going to be wetter than average. So that persistent wet signal we've seen is probably going to continue for a bit. All right, so don't squint, please. This is our monthly forecast bulletin. So this is just a screenshot. It's in the handout that we passed out in the room, and we'll get into the actual details of the lines here in just a minute. Just want to pause for a moment. This is a product that we put on our website. It's generated at the beginning of every month. It provides monthly mean water level forecasts for the next 6 months. And it provides a little bit of context. It's got some time going backwards, but we actually mail it out to about 4,000 people across the country, on hard copy. I get a copy at my house. My wife teases me. Why do you have this? I like it. So with that, we'll get into what the actual plots are, looking at the important relevant one here of Lake Superior. So we'll just talk about what the lines are. This is similar to ones that Lauren showed already. We have our long-term average monthly mean, which is the blue line, so you can see that annual cycle. It's a nice repeating pattern. And then the red line there is what we've seen for the last 2 years, so observed water level. It's a little hard to see probably from the back of the room, but there's dashes above and below. Those are our recorded maximum minimum monthly means for a given month with an associated year. And then the interesting part is on the right-hand side, there's a green dashed line, and that's what we call our coordinated forecast. So that's where we've done our forecasting processes, and we've coordinated that with the Canadian counterparts, and this is what we expect to see over the next 6 months. There's kind of a cone there, a red shaded cone. That's how we've applied uncertainty to that forecast. We're not going to pin it down to within a 7, 8, or 6 months from now. I wish we could, but just not something we can do with any sort of honesty there. So again, Lauren mentioned we have terrible URLs on the bottom there. Easy way to find all this stuff if you're just like, I want to look at it, but I don't know how to find it. Google Great Lakes High Water Detroit District, and we have a high water webpage with direct links to all this stuff too. So, all right. So Lauren already covered some of the recent records we've seen. So April, May, and June, Lake Superior set monthly mean record water levels. Continued in July and August, August, September, with tying the records. And then we saw another record high here in January. The January level this year was about 4 inches higher than the January level of last year. And we're expecting the lake to be at or within a couple inches of the record high really for the next 6 months. So we're still in a period of seasonal decline really into March, and then we'll start to see the lake tick upward as warmer temperatures finally arrive. Yeah, it's not necessarily a pretty picture. We'll move downstream to Lake Michigan Huron. I think the lake felt left out. We didn't actually set any records in 2019, but we set one in 2020 with record level in January, and we're expecting record high water levels on Lake Michigan Huron for the next 6 months. So we're current, January was 17 inches above the January level of 2019. So that's a big jump, and we're looking at another 4 to 7 inches above the monthly mean record high for the next 6 months as we go out. There's no more seasonal decline expected in Lake Michigan Huron. We're at a low point already, so we're going up there. Those impacts associated with that will continue. So we'll get some more circles here in the next 6 months or so. So we'll move on to Lake Erie. We'll skip St. Clair this time around. So last spring and summer, we set monthly mean record highs most of that period. We're already in our period of seasonal rise on Lake Erie, so we're further south. Things started melting sooner. And we're not expecting as large of a rise. We're not expecting records all 6 months, but we're going to start about 5 inches above record high levels, and then it'll slowly get to about 4 inches below. So still very high, still well above the long-term average. And again, we're 7 inches above January 20. Okay, so moving on to Lake Ontario. So again, we're already in our period of seasonal rise. A little further south. We're not expecting any record water levels for Lake Ontario over the next 6 months. We are expecting well above average, 13 to 23 inches above the long-term average there. Again, 9 inches above the January 2020 level. 2019, we set, again, as Laura mentioned, the record high in the period of record. So, any given month last July or in June. So that's kind of those. This is a fun tool I like to look at. Again, we'll look at the actual line types in a moment. This is our water level outlook. So this isn't a forecast. As much as I wish we could forecast out a year, we can't and we don't. This is really a tool to help us answer the question of what if. So what if we got a really dry year? What if we got a really wet year? What if we had a really weird year like back in 1918, one of the first ones, right? This is where we can take the models that route the water, into the lakes and balance the levels between the lakes, and we can take all of the observed supply sequences we have in our record, and we can route it through them and see what happens. So we'll talk about what that looks like. We can basically take what we've seen in that long period record and kind of what's the range of futures look like. So again, this should start to look a little familiar. We've got a little bit different. We've got dots instead of that blue line for our long-term average. We've got the dashes on the bottom and the top for our monthly maximum minimums, and then the solid black line here is going to be the observed water levels. This is where this one gets interesting. So now we're going up to January of 2021. We go a full year, so we can take that full year of water supply sequences. And we start adding, the whole range, which is the gray. So like that whole 100+ years of data, that's kind of like, if we just took every one of the years and ran through, that's the range of that data. It's kind of that gray band or plume, if you will. And then there's a couple specific line types there, or colors, and I've got a note here just so I keep them straight. The green line, so the one that kind of goes up and flattens off and comes back down, that's a what if we saw last year all over again. The blue line is another high supply year in 1996. So what if we saw in 1996 all over again? Where does that put us? And then the purple line is 2017, another recent year of really high net basin supplies. And that also, where does that put us? None of those looks pretty or good. From water level impacts point, that's not good news if that's what we were to see. We don't know if we will. And it's just kind of the what if component. The other thing that's really relevant on this plot is, in order for us to get water levels, so the bottom of that gray plume, down near our long-term average there, we would have to have really, really dry conditions. And you're talking about some of the driest stuff we've seen in that 100+ years. I don't like to throw drought of record or scary stuff like that, but we would need sustained dry conditions for a long period of time in order to have a return to what we would even consider normal. So we'll change gears a little bit. So this is a product that actually we put, the Corps of Engineers and Sea Grant put this out a few years ago. It's available. Don't try to write that down, please. The web URL. So it's available on our website. I think Sea Grant's website as well. The contact information is definitely out of date. However, our coastal engineers have looked at it and said, yeah, this is still really good information. So if you have property on the shoreline, if you have an interest of like, how do I protect my home, or how do I take care of my beach, those kind of things, this is a phenomenal resource. It kind of looks at everything from like preventing erosion to top down, like how do I route my gutters so I'm not eroding my bluff, to how do I tow protection, what do I look for when I'm looking for a contractor or a consultant to do this kind of work. So it's a really good resource. I have a copy on my desk. I actually flip through it at lunch sometimes just because I'm impressed with some of the work that they did quite a while ago. It's still really relevant and really well presented. Also, we'll touch on this for one slide really briefly, just because it's a question we get quite frequently. And what can the Corps do for me? Our emergency response authorities are pretty limited, so they're really meant to supplement local resources. So starting at county level, township level, that goes up through the state, and then eventually at some point we can start supplementing those resources. And the one at the bottom, for direct assistance, sandbags, plastic barriers, that kind of stuff, that is for protecting public infrastructure. FEMA is the agency that does private residences and that kind of stuff. That's not something we can do. Our authorities that allow us to work just don't permit that. Here on the next slide, if you really have questions about the emergency management component, please talk to Pat Cooney, our Chief of Emergency Management. He can get you squared away. We work pretty closely with them, so I have zero qualms giving his name and email out there. If you have questions on permitting, like you want to put some sort of wetland protection, those kind of things. Regulatory department, so we are the regulatory body for the Great Lakes. We have to do that. We do that with EGLE, right? Environment, Great Lakes Energy, state. And then Lauren and I have our contact information here. We also have an outreach coordinator. So outreach coordinator, that's really if you had something where you're like, hey, I really need to commission a study to look at erosion and deal with problems. Those are much longer time frames. You're talking a year to 10 years. So that's not, hey, I have a problem that needs to be fixed now. That's we're looking at cost sharing something over the next several years and kind of pursuing that. So Jim Luke would be the person to talk to in that regard. And then I will pause. We can open up for questions.
Question.
Yes, sir.
I'll try to speak up because it's a big room.
Yeah, we'll repeat it too. That way people on the web can hear it.
When I was a teenager, which is not recent, another teenage girl got stuck on one of the rocks in the upper Niagara River between New York and Goat Island. And the dispatcher, they sent police to her to save her. And she was in like 6 feet of water. So some smart dispatcher called Ontario Hydro And in about 20 minutes, they dropped the the river level 6 feet. If they did that, that 6 feet would trickle all the way up to Lake Superior eventually. I know there's the shipping interest would not enjoy that, but what they did was obviously they would aggravate Ontario, Lake Ontario, but it could reduce the water levels in all the upper Great Lakes. Do you have any comment? Do you remember the incident? Well, yeah, you
So I definitely don't remember the incident.
You
There's a good
weren't
chance I wasn't born, right?
Yeah.
for 20 minutes, 6 feet, and they walked out to get it and walked it back.
Yeah, that's an incident I'm not familiar with, but there is regulation at the Niagara River. The regulation that's the regular regulation is there to not control the total amount of flow in the Niagara River. So under normal conditions, you're not controlling the total amount of flow, just allocating between the hydropower facilities and the falls. And that's dependent on what time of year it is, what time of day, etc. Now, I don't know anything about that specific incident, but I will say that the amount of, I'm sure it was a significant amount of flow at the moment, but the amount of flow that's coming in and the net basin supply conditions are so that's going to be so much larger than what you might see in kind of a short blip time frame. I'm sure it had short-term impacts.
It would make the falls look less pretty.
Yeah.
But they do that at night anyway.
Yeah, so he's pointing out that they do change the flow through the falls and the hydropower at night anyway. And yeah, so that's where the regulation comes to play, is in allocating the flow between the falls and the hydropower.
But does Ontario, Canada suffer erosion now too?
Yeah, throughout the Great Lakes, we're seeing erosion impacts on the U.S. and Canadian side of things, both erosion and flooding impacts.
The Montreal River going from Georgian Bay and Huron Bay, that is over bankflow, as well as some of the other rivers that are coming from the north. And I wonder if there's a study that is categorizing in years and such like you have here, if there is a noticed change, and if that is attributed to the possibility of polar ice being melting and then running south, coming into Lake Superior. Is there a study?
Okay, so question is, the high stream flows that we're seeing in the northern portion of the basin coming into the lake. You mentioned Montreal River. I can't remember what else you mentioned, but Mishpacotton River. Yeah, okay. So rivers that are coming into the north side of the lake have been pretty high flows, and asking whether that's in relation to melting ice. Are you just referring to climate change in general, or like melting ice caps feeding the rivers?
Both.
Both. So we get the question as to whether flows and precipitation and water levels are being driven by climate change pretty frequently. One thing that I think you'll notice when you just look at the long-term hydrograph, we certainly have periods of highs and periods of lows. It's not as simple as like when we look at the ocean coasts and we think of climate change impacts, in the form of melting ice and raising sea levels. On the Great Lakes coast, we have to think about those overlay processes, and so those can be affected in different ways by climatic conditions, in terms of evaporation and precipitation over the lake. That's, I think, one part of the answer, and the other part is the melting ice influencing the river flows. So certainly, like if there's warmer conditions within the basin itself, so anything that's, if the snowpack is melting earlier, that would be impacting the runoff conditions in those northern portions of the basin. Great question. She asked about, and asking how we determine something like a 100-year flood here. And I mean, in general, I would say we look at the data. Now, I don't do this, so I'm not gonna say how the engineers did, but I will say that one thing that I know is that the flooding that we're seeing here isn't the kind of flooding that you see, when the Delaware River floods, you have a big flood wave that's huge and dramatic and then recedes eventually. What you guys are experiencing, if you're experiencing flooding at your location, this is a seasonal impact. It's you're having flooding periodically when conditions are setting up stage events or whatever. But this is a longer term kind of, I almost want to say lower grade, longer term flooding situation. So it's not the kind of flooding that we think of on the national scale when we're talking about flooding. Good question.
Yeah, I'll add on to that one just a little bit, since I've got a little bit of background in kind of riverine modeling, flood modeling. So if you're looking at the river, that's one thing. On the coast and the estuaries, where you have a river coming into the lake, and if you're looking at, like rainfall frequency, how frequent do you get these large events? And then you also are looking at wind frequencies and some other what we call coincident peaks. So like you're not going to have the 1% chance of rain and the 1% chance of wind together and call that the 1%. So it involves some statistical processes there. And then the people who do that is FEMA. So that's not the Corps of Engineers who do right here in the lecture.
Yeah, thank you. To ask his question in a different way, is this the new normal? And I think the answer, what I've heard here, is any model that's used for the oceans, we don't use the same model for the Great Lakes.
So I'll stay with that one. So the question is this the new normal? I wish we knew. It is the honest answer. So when you're looking at that period of long low water period, right, the discussion within the scientific community was this might be the new normal. We're going to see sustained periods of low water. And then we had that 2-year rise, right, where we, fastest 2-year rise we've seen in that period of record. So as we're looking at it, and the research is ongoing, kind of the new thinking is we should expect to see faster transition from high to low. You should be prepared for both high water and low water impacts. It's kind of a change. Does warmer air hold more water? Yeah, it does. That's a scientific fact. So that way we'll speak to that tiny bit. So the question is, what kind of time period the ordinary high water mark is established? I don't know the direct, here's what period they're looking at. I know that we're in the process of updating the Great Lakes datum, so the reference that we call for an elevation. And in that process, there's an evaluation of the ordinary high water mark. So that it was, supposed to be IGLD is the datum name in 2020. I don't remember what the time frame for that actually coming out is, but they look at that. I don't know what the process or progress is.
And that's really focused on the low water datum, and then so I think that ordinary high water mark kind of varies from state to state how it's developed. So I'm less familiar with the ordinary high water.
So the question was, how much control do we actually have? And it's specifically at the same area. So starting with the can we do something? And the first question is, are we allowed to, right? So the Lake Superior Board of Control is international between the U.S. and Canada. So we don't just get to act unilaterally and go about that route because of those treaties that we have in place. And as far as the physical, is the structure large enough to have an impact? It can have a very, very small impact. And then you're moving the problem from one place to another, right? So any reduction in levels here is going to result in a rise on Lake Michigan. Anything worth adding there, Mark?
Yeah. So yeah, the outflow through the St. Mary's River, you guys are, I'm sure, familiar with that being a regulated place. The flows are regulated through Plan 2012, and the International Joint Commission is the governing body behind those decisions. And that plan starts with evaluating what the pre-project flow would be, or what the flow would be without the infrastructure that's there, the control that's there. And then it takes that pre-project flow and tries to balance the impacts on Lake Superior and Lake Michigan Huron. And then after doing that, it looks at the physical and operational limits of the system. For example, what does a sturgeon need to spawn every few years? And then after that, it allocates flow between hydropower plants and the rapids, and how many gates to be open. So yes, the flow is regulated with targets that are related to water levels. However, the degree that we can actually successfully regulate water levels with the outflow is really small. And that's because we have a lot of variability, especially month-to-month variability in net basin supply. And not only is it highly variable, it's hard to predict, so that makes regulation hard. But it's the variability in month-to-month in the net basin supply that we're talking about is really so much substantially larger than the amount of control that can be exerted on the St. Mary's River. And so that's why, while we do have regulation of St. Mary's River flows, the impact on the lake levels in terms of regulation is really pretty small.
And that may address a question that we have from an online listener. I'm sorry. That earlier you showed the elevations of the Great Lakes. What is stopping us from letting water out of the Welland Canal?
Okay, question about what's stopping us from letting water out of the Welland Canal. I think we get this question pretty often too, especially like people who are on Lake Erie and getting flooded. They're like, why can't we just get water out? And I understand where that's coming from. So a few things come to play. First is that the amount of flow that you can actually send through the Welland Canal is pretty small. Like the average flows, I want to say on the order of, I think in terms of cubic meters per second, but like 200 cubic meters per second compared to the net basin supply of water levels, or net basin supply of water on Lake Erie, which can be several thousands of cubic meters per second for some months. And so, the amount that you could actually send through the canal is small. I mean, and then consider upstream, downstream impacts. Even if you could control things, think of Lake Ontario's had flooding 2017 and 2019. So that's something to consider, even if you could. I'll start by, so the first question is related to what can a homeowner, what's the best resource for a homeowner to start with trying to protect your property. So this Living on the Coast book is kind of where I would start, to start looking at ideas. We can't actually recommend, contractors or that kind of thing. But that would be a place to start. And, in terms of like understanding permitting processes, talking to the regulatory department would be important there. But
Go ahead, Jen.
So EGLE is the state environmental Great Lakes and Energy website. They've created a site that's called High Water. So if you Google EGLE, E-G-L-E, High Water, there are the state resources that are available to you there. They've shortened the permit time. There are an approved list of contractors. There's a bill now in front of the state legislature that if you're using an approved contractor, you don't have to actually get a permit. It's a bill, it's not law yet, but that's happening right now. So EGLE, E-G-L-E, High Water, that'll get you there.
So thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you.
Second piece of the question was related to working with FEMA. This is kind of outside of my expertise. I'm sure people in the board work with FEMA people, but that's kind of, I think what you probably meant was that
I personally don't work with them. That's great.
So I'm afraid I'm not able to just personally and don't have the knowledge and the answer the question on how. So this was a technical question about our forecast process and how we're using forecast information such as the quantitative precipitation forecast that we showed and the Climate Prediction Center seasonal forecast, seasonal outlook. And whether we use those directly in our forecast modeling that we do or whether we're just kind of using it, peripherally to hedge our bets kind of forecast. I'd say it's a little of both. We actually run several different models to predict net basin supply. Some of them use actual forecast information. So for example, we have one called the Great Lakes Advanced Hydrologic Prediction System, which was developed by NOAA's Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory. And that is an ensemble forecast system that allows us to take the probability of being above or below average precipitation and the probability of being above or below average temperature and kind of match historical sequences of meteorology to that probability expectation to match that, and then use that to drive our net basin supply forecast. And from that, we look at the median forecast, and that's one of the models that we look at. We run other models that can actually take, so we have a statistical model that one of the inputs is actually the forecasted temperature and precipitation. So we look at another product called the North American Multi-Model Ensemble Forecast to look at the precipitation and temperature forecast as input. But I will say that at the end of the day, we have some models that are directly driven by temperature, precipitation, meteorological conditions. Some models that are more statistically based, looking at supplies from the past, trends, and kind of other conditions from the past, like precipitation and temperature, and what we're looking at ahead. We run several models, and then we kind of digest what those models are telling us. We look at what we're expecting. We look at our basin conditions. We put a lot of consideration into what the current soil moisture is, what the current snowpack is, what the current lake surface temperature is. We consider all of that in evaluating our model output, because we don't want to just take the model output as a black box and say yes, that's it. We want to say, is that reasonable? And from that, we take all that information, and then we do apply some judgment to understand what the best forecast is, what we think the best forecast is. And I'll say that then, after we do that process, what you're seeing in the final product is actually the result of coordinating our process with theirs. So we don't run the same forecasts. They're running theirs independently. We're running ours independently. At the end of the day, we come together and we say, here's what we're thinking, here's what you're thinking. Okay, we can agree on this.
The soil moisture must impact lake levels, and when you have higher lake levels, does that drive higher soil moisture? And then the other follow-up is I was at a meeting with the state folks, which is how I knew about the high levels a week and a half ago. And the other thing that they were worried about, at least downstate, is that all the inland lakes are full too. So with the inland lakes being full, where are they going to go? They want to drain into the Great Lakes, and they're running into full water there too. And so inland communities are starting to have problems, but I'm not hearing about that too much here, and I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, sure. So I also grew up in a farming community, and I was talking to my neighbors, or my mom's neighbors, I guess. They were late getting in the fields, and most of them had to abandon their crop this year just to groundwater. So the question really has to do with soil moisture, and one, just make sure I captured all that, is do the high water levels influence soil moisture, and then two, like what's going on with soil moisture, how that kind of impacts everything else, right? But capture, okay. So generally speaking, no, the Great Lakes water levels don't impact your soil moisture throughout the whole basin. If you're talking about your beach, right, it's right there, right? So in the immediate vicinity of the shoreline, yes, it can. If you have a cliff, probably not, right? That said, we are seeing high groundwater levels across the basin. Yes, the lakes and streams are full. I work a lot with our stakeholders in Northeast Wisconsin as well. I think Wisconsin itself as a state abandoned almost as much corn as the nation does on an annual average. This last year, just because they couldn't get in the fields to harvest. The groundwater was that high. That translates into higher flows. So, with that work, I work with our Lake Winnebago mission, where we're managing that water level in that lake, and we're actively drawing the lake down further than normal to provide for that additional soil moisture and runoff, and enhanced runoff that we expect to see during the spring. So once that snow melts, soil moisture is kind of normal. Some of it percolates into the groundwater. This year, we're not expecting to see a lot of that. So we're expecting to see, when that snow melts, it's going to go into the lakes and streams, and then eventually to the Great Lakes.
Does the weight of the higher lake level make the erosion more likely, or is it in the action of the water, but also just the sheer mass of having more water?
Yes. So the question is, if the weight of the high water levels increases the likelihood of erosion. So depth of water has a function, or it relates to what we call shear stress, and kind of a transport regime. So depth and velocity are kind of the two things that kind of move sediment, right? The coastal erosion is happening all the time. It's just a question of how close to your house is or how close to your structure is it. It's happening out to about 30 feet depth of water. But then the rivers and lakes, so you have some higher shear stresses and you have potential for different velocities than normal. So you can, with the higher depth, the higher shear stress, you can mobilize some more sediment on the bottom. So you have wave action on the top, which is now hitting things that it hasn't hit for quite a long time, or ever in our period of record. And then you also have the stuff on the bottom that can get scoured out a little bit. So the erosion piece of that is pretty complicated and very site specific. I'm looking at a site in Duluth right now where it's really a function of the station on Lake Superior is driving the flow in and out of this little embayment. That's causing the erosion more than the flow from the dam. So very site specific on that kind of stuff. All right, so I said we come back over here. So.
Now, I'm wondering about how often people get together to determine the outflow at St. Mary's, who it is, and how do we get reports when they decide to change their outflow?
So the question is how long a decision is made on the outflow at St. Mary's, right?
How often?
Yeah, how frequently that decision is made, who makes the decision, and then how you get information on it. So we'll start with who makes the decision. So that's the Lake Superior Board of Control makes a recommendation to the International Joint Commission. They make the decision, according, following the Plan 2012 that we talked about. And that happens on a monthly basis. So on a monthly basis, people in our office provide technical support and analysis to the Board of Control who rolls that decision recommendation upward. So on a monthly basis, that decision is made. And then I believe the Lake Superior Board of Control would be the place to get that information. So you can find them on Facebook and online.
And we actually, on the Detroit District website, you can get to a news release after the decision is made. There'll be a news release that's put on, I don't know if it's a link on our page. But if you go to our Great Lakes information page, there is a link on there for Lake Superior regulation. So if you just get to our Great Lakes information page and you'll find it there.
Yes.
Do y'all keep track of the weather and the storms? It seems like we're having more and bigger storms with higher winds than normal, and I don't know if that's accurate, but do you all keep track of that?
So the question is whether we keep track of storms and wind, and whether that's been changing over time. Like we've had more intense storms and more high winds. We've kind of been peripherally hearing about this, and trying to understand in terms of whether this is an increasing phenomenon. I'm not sure we know yet whether this is something that is increasing into the future or not. That's a good question, though.
So down here in front, then we'll go up there.
So you mentioned it was kind of like a case-by-case study when it came to like erosion. Would you find the more hard anthropogenic structures more susceptible to the rising water levels and erosion rather than like soft structures?
So the question is whether hard structures are more susceptible to erosion than soft structures.
With water levels,
Yeah. Yeah, with water levels. So I guess let me further clarify my understanding. What do you mean by soft structures?
Like beaches with beach grass, sand, all that, compared to like bulkheads and all that.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll answer this a little bit. I work with our coastal engineering, kind of actually a regional tech resource. And he services the entire Great Lakes and Ohio River Division. So the best protection from erosion is a nice long flat beach, because the wave kind of comes up, it gradually goes up and dissipates its energy, right? So when you start talking about other types of erosion protection, the type of protection, like if you can dissipate that energy, you're better. So beach grass is great until it's not. Once you exceed the threshold on beach grass, it's gone, and then you have just raw sand, and then it goes really quickly. Harder structures can resist more wave energy directly as water levels rise. They are susceptible to undercutting, and all structures require maintenance. It's not like we can just drop something in and it's good for 100 years. Well, we wish we could, but we can't. So with that, the harder structures also generate a different wave climate immediately outstream. You can see it really noticeably if you ever buy like a sheet pile wall or something along those lines. And, you know, or if you go kayaking along pictured rocks. So my wife and I did that a few years ago. I'm like, oh, it's pretty nice out here. We get a little closer to the rocks, and now the wave is like double because it's bouncing off and generating more energy. So it changes kind of the energy dynamics in that nearshore environment. So harder structures are more resistant to higher energy, but they also generate some other issues. So gentleman up here.
Sure. The question is, you know, in terms of the total water balance, is outflow to downstream lakes or evaporation more important? And on the bigger picture, I wish I had that graphic. No, I don't think I have. I don't think I have as showing outflows and inflows, precipitation, runoff, and evaporation. These are all, like, every single one of the components of the water balance is significant. So in terms of the water balance, and evaporation is really much more significant than we might think. You know, it's a similar order of magnitude to the runoff to the lake and the precipitation to the lake. So similar order of magnitude on an annual basis. So it's really pretty significant. But I don't have the numbers in front of me to have like a direct comparison between.
Well, if you think of the question is, you're talking about cubic meters per second out of one of the outflows, and you're talking about net basin supply is, you know, a factor of 5 or something larger. So I was thinking it must be evaporation. Maybe I read into that a little too much.
Yeah, it's really, yeah. So pointing out that the net basin supply can be quite a bit higher than outflows, or than. Well, now is the question. Yeah. So yes, it's really, we have to look at the full combination of the variability. Like runoff and precipitation are also highly variable and can be, you know, either large or small, right? So yeah, the combined influence of all of those things.
I'll add to that that evaporation component is seasonal, right? So like in the springtime, it's not as high, and then in the, you know, late fall, early winter, when it's really cold air over the warm water, it's way high. So if you hold the net basin supply constant, you're effectively holding that constant, and that gets hard to answer too. So the question was, in this particular case, is his neighbors have put some shoreline protection in hard structures, and then he's seeing some impacts, and you are seeing something that's different than what you would expect to see normally prior to that. First of all, that sounds like a doozy of a problem. Like that's a hard one for sure. You know, again, going back to kind of the erosion stuff that's site specific. If I were in your shoes, I would strongly consider finding a qualified coastal engineer to look at it. You know, being able to tell you, okay, what is your normal shoreline drift? You know, there's some sand flowing along the shoreline. You know, how does that behave? You know, what is going on there? You know, and you know, then that could go all the way into like a legal battle, right? You know, if your neighbors are actually impacting your property, those kind of things. So I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna stop there. Right. Yeah, my office of counsel is gonna be really unhappy with me if I start going any further than that. So
I'm just gonna throw another plug in for the Living on the Coast booklet, because they actually have some really nice graphics to show, like, if you get together with your neighbors, this is an option that you can do, you know, that kind of thing. So it may be a way to, you know, communicate what's going on.
Yeah, so the question is, how do we develop the projections from our water level outlook tool, right? So what those are is we have supply sequences, so in January, February, all the way through the year, right, of what the net basin supply was. So what, you know, we said plus evaporation and runoff, right? So we take that supply sequence, so what was coming into the lake, and then we route that into the model. And this is across all of the Great Lakes. So it handles, you know, what is the flows, you know, from that, and how do the lakes interact with the environment. So it's not taking the water levels and just superimposing them with the changes in water levels. It's imposing, you know, what if we got the same environmental or meteorological conditions that drove those water levels?
And just add on to that, we try to think of scenarios that are of interest. You know, so I think in 2014, we were looking at high ice cover, and we were thinking, what would happen, you know, or what happened in other years when there was high ice cover. So we kind of selected, like when you look at the graphic on here that has scenarios, these kind of specific lines on there, we can kind of say, let's find a year when something interesting happened that's relevant to today. So recently this product has been showing what if it's wet? And that's just because that's the question that we're getting. What if we have another year like 2019, et cetera? So recently it's been that, but we have, it's kind of a nice way to think about things outside of just specifically what's forecasted.
We usually sit around as a group, meeting once a month, like, well, what's going on now that could be relevant, in future years. So like, what if we have another warm? So the question is, if the federal government, FEMA, Corps of Engineers, or others have allocated money for protecting the shoreline, I can speak in a very, very limited manner in that. I know our emergency management group is working with several counties in Michigan and Wisconsin. That request has to come from the county through the state to us. And that's a wide variety of stuff. There are some of those requests are getting funded. We, like our authorities for emergency type stuff, it's pretty explicit that we can't address erosion as the Corps of Engineers. So if that's what you're getting at, I don't think we've allocated any resources there. We're just not allowed to by the authorities that we operate.
Online question here. So a question from Ryan. It's been a winter with well below average lake ice coverage on Lake Superior. Shouldn't that lead to increased evaporation and contribute to lowering water levels? Polar vortex years have been associated with increasing lake levels, so shouldn't the opposite be happening after a warmer winter?
So we talked a little bit about how it's the gradient or the difference in temperature between the warm lake and the cold lake that drives it. So if the lake surface temperature is 35 degrees and the air temperature happens to be 32, 33, 34, it's really not driving the evaporation. If you think about a still morning on the lake, right, you can see the mist rising up, coming from the lake, especially in a nice cold fall day, that's water and heat leaving the lake. So, that evaporation process actually helps drive the lowering temperatures and ice formation. So it's a complicated process. We like to think of, the ice as a lid. It's either shutting evaporation off or letting it continue on. And when we see these warm winters, the models and kind of this, the physics approach when we look at it really indicates that we're seeing lower evaporation until we get a week like this where, it was a high of 5 degrees this morning when we got up. And that drives a lot of evaporation in a hurry, but it doesn't necessarily, over that month-long period equate to the same amount. So as far as how that impacts water levels in particular polar vortex years, I'll hand that one off to Lauren.
Yeah, so certainly, so he explained kind of the energy component of it. When you have warm surface water temperatures, cold air, you're going to have a lot of evaporation, and how that makes it complex relating ice cover to evaporation, because when you look on the seasonal basis, when you have high ice cover, that means you had a lot of cooling, right? And so you had a lot of energy exchange, and so you may have had a lot of evaporation early on in the season. But we do see, when there are kind of spikes in cold air temperatures over warm surface water temperature, like the image of Lake Superior from February 13th, just last week. This is a case where, we do have a lot of evaporation that day. So it's a complex relationship. You can't just say just because we have high ice cover means we're going to just cap off evaporation. It's not as simple as that. One thing that we look into is how does ice cover, or more specifically, how does the lake heat content in the winter affect, subsequent seasons? So does that lake heat content persist into the subsequent fall? Maybe you have a warmer lake and warmer lake still than it would have been. So there are kind of like these potential longer term impacts. So that's something that we're looking into. Yeah. So you bring up a really good point. So the question is, saying maybe I'm a devil's advocate, but how can we look at the past 100 years and say this is what we expect for the future, given the changes that we see, around the globe and in hydrology, we think of it as non-stochastic or
Not stationary.
non-stationary, thank you, non-stationary behavior, in that we have a changing climate, and it's kind of understood. We can't always look to the past to predict the future anymore. Sometimes that's what we're limited to with current tools. We are looking at using newer tools that are actually, relying on the global forecast models. So like this multi-model ensemble that uses forecast models to drive our net basin supply. I think it's still very important to show the past 100 years, to show where we are now relative. Our current, like the uncertainty that we put around our forecast, currently we are using the full 100-year or 100+ year period of net basin supply. We're looking into whether we need to change that. For example, use a more recent 30-year period or something. So that's a valid question, and something that we're working on thinking about in terms of the science behind the modeling that we do.
I'll add on to that a little bit. So I get to play in both the Great Lakes region, or I guess arena, and also kind of riverine stuff as well. And we see that in inland streams as well. In fact, the Corps of Engineers has developed some tools internally, like Saginaw River, for example. Are we seeing more high flows? Are we seeing longer periods of high flows? Are those properties changing? And for a river with a single gauge with a good period of record, you can start to get at that. For the Great Lakes, it's a much more complicated problem. You're talking huge areas, not as well gauged as we'd like, overlay processes that Lauren's talking about. So it's actively being researched and looked at. Like how do we do this? Because there's changes that may not be necessarily applicable to when the period record started. All right, so I think there was one more over here. Yeah.
I have a question about does the Great Lakes shipping industry have any influence on how much on the flow of water out of the St. Mary's?
So,
With the larger shipping, with the larger ships, greater draft, is there any influence with that? That rumor is floating out there that the gates are kept locked because you need higher water for shipping.
Yeah, so the question is whether or not the shipping and maybe some sort of large dark lobby is keeping the the gates locked at Sault Ste. Marie, right? So the shipping industry is for now okay with the high water levels because they don't have to light load as much. So there is certainly shipping and navigation benefits. No reason to pretend that there isn't.
Explain light load.
Explain light load. So the ships on the Great Lakes are currently loading less capacity than they're able to actually carry in terms of iron ore. So iron ore that leaves kind of the Arrowhead, northern Minnesota, through Lake Superior, through the Soo Locks, and then all the way down to the foundries, northern Indiana and Ohio.
Grain. Grain as well.
Yeah, grain. Yep. But basically, they're not carrying as much mass or weight as they could be. So they've got more volume capacity there. So if they have deeper water, more draft in the harbors, they can carry more. They can, it's less. The regulation of Lake Superior outflow through the St. Mary's River is, through that international border control, they're weighing impacts, so they're trying to balance the impacts on Superior and Michigan Huron. And, that plan is pretty well set. Was shipping incorporated in that? Yeah, the economics of both Canada and the U.S. are pretty important there. Is there a lobby that, nope, just keep them locked, we want to keep the water high. It's high in both places, right? It's not as though keeping the gates closed at the St. Mary's Rapids is going to, make it better in Lake Superior versus Lake Michigan Huron. It would have an adverse impact and lower their capacity downstream. Does that kind of answer your question? Yes, those impacts are considered in the formulation of the plan and the decisions of the International Joint Commission. It's not something that it's an active process. It's pretty well set within the plan itself.
So it doesn't have it seems like it's more how much evaporates. That's the biggest influence.
Yeah. So the biggest influence, I kind of encapsulate it in a sense, is the changing weather patterns that we see. So whether that's evaporation, rainfall, runoff, temperatures, those kinds of things. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned in the beginning of the presentation that you could find it on your Facebook page. If you don't Facebook, where can you find it?
So referring to on
This
Facebook.
PowerPoint presentation.
Oh, yes, the recording of
Yes.
this PowerPoint.
I'm here
presentation.
as for somebody else, so I'm trying to gather the information to bring it back to them.
Sure. We will have it on our michigansseagrant.org webpage as well. So if you're not a Facebook user, you can go on to Michigan Sea Grant, spelled all the way out, .org.
Okay, and this presentation would be on that?
It would be, yep.
Okay, very
Along
good.
with their dialogue and closed caption.
Perfect, thank you.
Thanks, great question.
So the question was how to view the presentation if you don't have Facebook. I'll also add that we put our phone numbers here for a reason. Anybody can call these numbers and we will talk to you. So we answer our phones. I spend a lot of my time on the phone these days. That's why my voice is a little hoarse. And so we're happy to talk to you. We really like, if I could talk to somebody one-on-one, it's helpful.
And those are direct lines, like you're gonna get, Laura or I on our desk. So it's not like you have to get through 7 levels or.
And if you do call our district and just say, hit 1 for water levels, it's gonna end up on one of our voicemails.
So, back over here for a question. We'll come back.
So just encapsulating, when you're saying that what drives the lake level going up and down is rainfall over the lake, rivers coming into the lake, and then evaporation off the lake, and then the flow out to the St. Lawrence River to the ocean.
For Lake Superior specifically, it'd be the outflow from the St. Mary's River. And ultimately, it'll go to the St. Lawrence River.
And what would drive it to be wetter or drier?
Well, the kind of a recap summary, we talked about net basin supply is our driver for Great Lakes water levels. And then the question is what would drive it to be wetter or drier? I wish I knew. That's well outside of my lane in terms of climate forecasting. So.
But I guess but since it looks like it's going to rain more, it's probably going to be wetter, and it's probably going to have the lake levels go up.
Okay.
And there's nothing indicating that it's going to look like it's going to be drier.
So question is what makes it wetter or drier? And if we think of just precipitation in general, like that's going to be driven by global and regional atmospheric patterns and stuff. But remember, sometimes when we're talking about wet, it may sound like we're just talking about precipitation, but we're often just referring to that total combination of precipitation, runoff, and evaporation. So if you have, we might refer to it as wet if you have some evaporation. So that would be driven also by temperature and surface water temperature, et cetera.
All right, so before we go upstairs.
Yeah, we'll take one more here from our online audience. Mariana asked, you mentioned a shared governing body between the US and Canada that must agree on regulating activity to the Great Lakes levels. If you can comment on this, what is happening at that level to address the high lake levels?
So the question is, what's happening in terms of conversation at the like binational level, if I understand correctly?
Yes.
We're not directly engaged in that conversation, but we are providing support in the form of modeling and stuff. So, for example, some of you may have heard of the Long Lac-A-Nagotee diversion, which actually puts a little bit of water into Lake Superior. So we've provided some modeling support to demonstrate potential influences of shutting that down. So there's conversations happening. Where that's going, I don't know. I'm not privy to.
Then upstairs. Thanks for being patient.
Do you, with all of your data that you have, the lakes are, the big lakes, do you have any ability to predict like where erosion is going to be worse in an area, let's say in Munising, Michigan versus Muskegon, Michigan, or do you do anything like that? Well, erosion is bad all over.
Right. So the question is if we have the ability to predict where erosion tends to be worse. There's some really kind of wide information, prior studies on what does the coast look like, right? As far as correlating that to changing lake levels, I'm not aware of anything that kind of says, oh, rising lake levels will be worse here versus there. There's some information out there that says, oh, okay, well, Pictured Rocks is great because you have a large rock face, right? Probably not going to get as much erosion as a sands bluff in the southern portion of Lake Michigan. And as far as like direct impacts from rising lake levels and changes, I'm not aware of anything. Are you, Lauren?
The only thing I would add is that I know of multiple kind of efforts to quantify resiliency of coasts. So for example, like Wisconsin Sea Grant, New York Sea Grant, both have separate studies for their coastlines. So there's a fair amount of effort in terms of quantifying the capacity or the resilience, I guess, of coastlines to this kind of changes. Have a emphatically raised two hands.
FEMA has the data sets.
Okay.
I just have a question on your Great Lakes resources. There's a Great Lakes Shore Viewer. What does that do? It says it visualize risk to buildings, infrastructure, and shorelines.
We do have a resident expert in our midst.
Yeah, so there's a few buttons on it. Well, you can do several things. There's aerial photography of the coastline through all of the UP and even down to Lake Michigan for some of Lake Michigan. You can turn buttons on and off. And some of those buttons will show you risk based on distance of structures from the shoreline, risk based on soil type, which some soil types might be more prone to erosion. And there's another button on there that shows slope, and in theory, higher slope, like more prone to erosion.
So I live over in Ontonagon. Would I be able to see the shoreline there?
Yes.
And we own right on the lake, and we have buildings.
Yeah, so there's actually 3 different versions of the Shore Viewer up at a Superior Watershed Partnership's website. And it's kind of cool, as you can see, like on Noggin, you can see photos from 3 sets of time. I don't remember when the first year was. Yeah, like 2011 might have been the first time, and then 2016 was the last set. So you can even see some places where you can actually see the erosion over the course of like 5 or 6 years.
Cool.
And for those of you out there who live on the lake and you're experiencing erosion and you have photos of the damage, there's another link on one of these pages for the, what's called coastal reporting tool at the very bottom. It's pretty easy to use. It's another tool that's on our website. You just drop a pin where your property is, and upload photos, and we're trying to collect a record of all the erosion going on around Lake Superior.
Is Lake Superior unique in the evaporation field? Because when it evaporates and it creates lake effect snow, that water's not leaving the watershed. It's falling back down and it's going to run right back in the lake. So that evaporation really is kind of a shortcut. Is Lake Superior unique in the Great Lakes in that aspect, and do you guys take that into consideration?
So the question is whether the evaporation from Lake Superior is unique, because a lot of that's coming back down as lake effect snow, which is right. A lot of it's coming back down as lake effect snow. And we do it like in terms of how we account for that in our modeling. We're also looking at the precipitation and runoff, so that's being accounted for, from the water balance perspective. I read a study a couple of years ago from a group out of Wisconsin that was looking at actually like how the water is transported from one lake basin to the other, downstream atmospherically, when you have evaporation. Sure, some of that is coming back down, and sometimes a lot if you have a good lake effect snow event. But some of it is also being transported outside of the Lake Superior Basin. So it's a good question, and I've seen some work trying to quantify that.
Summarize that real quick. There's a Commentary on kind of the nature of shoreline protection. You're seeing, two things. One is if it's improperly installed, there's not enough rock or it isn't placed right, it doesn't really serve its purpose. And that's absolutely true. There's a reason it's expensive. There's a reason, I recommend hiring a coastal engineer to design it or someone who's qualified to design that protection. And then, kind of your commentary about, the hardened shorelines impact your neighborhood. That's also absolutely true. And, how that plays out is certainly going to depend on, who your neighbors are and how good of friends you are and those kind of things. We've seen communities get together and 4 or 5 properties together. They'll go do one effort together and they get some cost savings as part of that. As opposed to individual, kind of trying to do it piecemeal and the result isn't as good. So that's kind of a summary there. I think with that, we'll call it a wrap and say thank you, Martha, for hosting us, and thank you all for being patient and attentive. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you all for coming.